Hi, and welcome to this React Studio webinar. So today we're going to show you how to build a minimal single-page app in React Studio, going all the way from a sketch design into React code and running it in the browser, and even doing a mobile preview, which you can look up on your own device. So this will take about 30 minutes, maybe more, depending on how much I digress along the way. But here's the basic agenda. We'll go over some of the basic UI concepts, take a look at the Sketch plugin, which is not something that you're required to use, of course. You can make things inside React Studio without ever touching Sketch, but as a lot of people do use Sketch for designs, it's pretty convenient. Then we'll see about transforming the static design from Sketch into something that's actually responsive in the browser so that it adapts to different device sizes. We'll link it to some actual data so that we'll have a nice list which could be sourced from an actual API or other data source. And finally, we'll look at the mobile preview and other features that let you easily take your design and your React app outside of React Studio and view it on a device or do something with the code. And finally, if there's any questions, I'll cover those at the end of the demo, which is going to take about 30 minutes. Firstly, just a quick note about what is actually a single-page app. A lot of people probably know this, but just to give a quick recap of what's the whole point about doing apps the React Studio and the React way rather than what would be considered the old-fashioned server-based way. A single-page app basically runs the user interface in the browser inside one web page load, so you don't need to reload the browser for links, for example, when navigating into some detail and then back to the front page. If you look at something like Gmail, which is kind of the classic example of a single-page app, Gmail loads the page just once at start, and then all the actions and interactivity that happens inside Gmail is handled by JavaScript, so that you don't have to, for example, clicking on email, you don't actually have to reload the whole browser page, which would get annoying pretty fast, as anyone who did use webmail in the 90s probably remembers. So single-page apps really are a way to make web software, web-based applications feel more like native apps in a way. That's what people have become used to on their mobile devices, waiting for page loads. It's increasingly something that people don't want to do. So doing a single-page web app is a way to kind of bridge the user experience of the web and mobile native apps. And for that reason, because mobile is so important these days, React Studio is a mobile-first design tool, so we encourage you to think about mobile at every stage of the design, not just as an afterthought, but really start out with what the mobile experience is going to be. So with that, let's jump into React Studio. This is the screen you would see when starting up. We have a couple of project types you can start with. The one we'll be using today is mobile first web app. If you know that your app won't need a mobile responsiveness, you can also just start with a fixed size template. This could be nice for doing something like a desktop oriented app or TV app or whatever, where you can pretty much expect that there's not going to be mobile use. And finally, the last type available here is a component pack, which is great if you're perhaps working on a team that does React projects and you don't really need the whole app structure from React Studio. Instead, you just want to work on designing individual components, maybe using the Sketch plugin to bring in designs and transform those into React components. So component pack would be the way to go there. But for today, we'll go with mobile web app. And this is where we end up. So let's take a quick look around. The project map is the main view for your React Studio projects. It's a graphical representation of all the screens and other content that is used to build up your app. Up here we also have another tab called Data. We'll be looking at that later, but for now it's enough to know that these are the visual pieces, and under the Data tab we'll eventually be adding some of the data that is used to, in a way, fill out our design with the live content. Here we have something that you'll find in every project. It represents the base app itself. Some of the settings over here when selecting this block include the name of the app, an icon, the first launch, which simply means what's the first screen that will be displayed when this app loads, and then some settings for plugins, and then actually an interesting one is base format, which we could change, but we'll keep it on the smallest size for this mobile design. If we were making perhaps a more tablet-oriented app, we might want to change that, but for now we'll go with the phone-first design mentality. Secondly, we have one screen here by default. It's empty, it's white, there's nothing in it. To make some more, we can drag from the components pane over here. So these are actually the same types we already saw in the start screen. We can do responsive screens, fixed screens that don't adapt to mobile layout specifically, and then we can just build components on their own. And actually components are pieces we'll be using a lot in pretty much any React Studio project. But for now, let's just take a look at what happens inside this empty screen we have here. Double-clicking opens up the editing view. We have some drawing tools here. Now React Studio isn't Sketch or Illustrator. These are more like basic tools to let us create something on the fly without having to import everything. And then we have a list of the elements, which you can think of as basically similar to layers in Photoshop, except with the little twist that we have here 3 groups, which we'll look into shortly. We have the elements list, where we can find the various elements we can place into the view by dragging from here. And finally we have device previews for various devices. The selection here includes pretty much the tiniest, narrowest phone you'll find in the wild, an iPhone 4 or iPhone SE size. Then the same in landscape, then portrait tablet, and finally tablet or desktop size, which pretty much covers most of the rest. And with these 4, we already have a pretty good coverage of what the design will look on different devices. And of course we can always go into the web browser or do a mobile preview to actually see it in context. Let's try making something really simple. I'll use the draw tool just to add something here. Let's say a triangle. As we can see, this triangle element appeared here in the foreground group. It shows up on the device previews, and it's in the same position on all of these screens. Obviously, since we haven't yet done anything to make it adapt to the screen size somehow. Momentarily we'll be looking at various tools to actually do that responsive design. For now, let's just take a quick look at what the foreground and scroll flow groups are about. This is not specifically an HTML concept, but it's something we've found really useful to be able to distribute elements into background, flow, and foreground. These are things you'll find in pretty much any web app. You have something that might need to float on top, and then you have scrolling content. So let's drag some of these elements here just to give us an idea of what would happen if we have stuff in the scroll flow. Let's So here I have a couple of elements, and by default they go in the flow one after another. And the whole idea of the flow, of course, is that it behaves like the document model in HTML, so elements will push each other. And as you can see, if I move an element under the screen edge, what happens simply is that React Studio shows us the overflow. So this is the content that would become visible when the user scrolls, in contrast to Foreground, which stays put on the screen regardless of scrolling. So it's there's nothing more to it really. Next, let's see if we can kind of accelerate our design a bit. Let's look at the Sketch plugin. So we don't have to use Sketch, but it's really convenient for something like this app we're about to make here. What I have here is a tree artboard designed for a very simple travel app. There's a login screen, then you'll be presented with a list of these travel adventures, and finally the idea is that clicking on each adventure will take you to a screen that has more information about that particular experience. And we have a navigation bar here, very standard, like you'd find on mobile apps. So this is a pretty nice example of a mobile-first web app design that really tries to obey the conventions that people are used to on mobile. Let's transfer this to React Studio. Up here in plugins, we can find the React Studio plugin. We'll just move all of these artboards. And let's see what we got here on the React Studio side. Do a little housekeeping. So here we do have our 3 screens, and we also got 2 components. Now, where did these come from? Let's take a look at one of these components. This one is called list item, and if we go back to the Sketch document, we can see that this was actually represented as a group here on Sketch side, but the group is named with a prefix C and colon. So that indicates to the React Studio plugin that, hey, this group should actually become a component. We will want to use it as a component, a reusable visual block, and that's what happened. So this is actually a super convenient way to already do a bit of organization on your Sketch side, and then you'll be ready to turn this into pieces that you can use in code. Now, I think first let's just have a look at what does it look like now before we have done anything about the design. So since we brought this from Sketch, we can see that, okay, it's the right size for the phone size, but everything else looks a bit of a mess. Let's wire up these screens just so we'll have something we can view in the browser. I'll go here in App Settings, change First Launch to Login, and there we have that first connection. Then let's go to Login, choose this button, go to Interact tab up here on the right, and here we can define what should happen when the user touches this element. So let's choose Go To and the Adventure screen, and again we get a nice connection here. So what we want to happen next here in the Adventure screen is actually that clicking on this item would take us to its details view. So let's double click. This will take us to inside the component, and we can just specify for this image element here to go to the Adventure screen. And let's do some housekeeping on these just to see the connections a bit clearer. So there we actually have the basic skeleton of what this app structure looks like. From login to the main screen, and from inside the component, the user can click to go into a details view. Okay, let's see this in the browser. And I warn you, it's going to look like a mess because we haven't done anything about the design yet. So as we can see, here's the view just as we expected, but no responsiveness. There's some image overflow here since we haven't done anything to solve that, and clicking on this one will take us to the detail view, but there's no way to go back. So let's fix all of these problems. Now back here in React Studio. So the first thing we want to do is take this blue background, make it extend to the whole screen. And the easiest way to do this is to use the settings found here in the Layout tab. Under Align Edges, we can tell how this specific element should be attached, whether it's to one edge of the screen or multiple edges. These controls are pretty powerful in specifying the position of an element. So in this case, all we actually want to do is enable all these alignments, make this element attached on every side, and there we have it, blue background. Now for the rest of these elements, what we could do is use these center settings to make it centered, but that's actually not such a great idea because we have something more powerful available. It's called keylines. Let's click up here. This created a keyline, which is a yellow line, has a little diamond handle up here to drag it. And the keylines, the idea is that these are sort of the bones you can use to position elements inside the screen. This particular one, we would like to place it in the middle, so we can just drag it in the middle, or we can go over here and just say that, hey, I want this keyline to be straight in the middle. And then we'll just select all these elements. Let's do it this way instead. And here's a convenient shortcut down here. So align and center on keyline. And that's it. Now we have everything centered. And it's still possible, even though this is now attached to the keyline, we can do things like move an element a little bit. And then it will stay attached to the keyline, as we can see, but it has an offset from the keyline. So keylines are pretty powerful in creating these structured designs, which is what we need for responsiveness, obviously. And in this case, I made the offset by dragging from here, but I can of course clear it by just adding, oops, that's the wrong one. So let's clear the left offset so it stays back on the keyline. And finally, there's something we would like to fix about these fields here. So if we go back in the browser and see what happens, is that, well, we can actually type into this field, but this placeholder text floats on top of it. So how did this happen? Let's take a look at the sketch document we have here. So we have a obviously, since Sketch doesn't really understand the meaning of elements, it's a drawing tool. When you want to make a text field, all we have here is a white rectangle. But we've used another one of these little conveniences available in the React Studio plugin. We've specified input in the name of this element. And so React Studio, based on that, has transferred these rectangles as actual text fields. So actually what we just need to do is take out these placeholder text that came from Sketch and select the text field here, and we can just type in a new placeholder text here, and this will be an actual placeholder. And same for this one. And let's also change this field's type to password, so then it behaves like a password field. And see what happens. Okay, so now we have the placeholders, and when I start typing it goes away, and for the password it behaves just as we expected. Yep, so let's fix this screen next. The first thing we should actually do is the navigation bar. If we look back to the sketch document, what we had here was we have the same navigation bar in both, and we need the back button. So actually this is something we don't have to do manually at all. It's such a common feature that React Studio lets us enable the navigation for each screen just by selecting the screen and clicking on nav bar. And now we can see that we'll have a standard styled nav bar. For this screen we don't want the back button, since obviously there's no point in going back to login, so we can just disable that. And we can also delete this blue placeholder we brought in from Sketch. But now we would definitely like to change the nav bar color to match the one we had in Sketch, so let's fix that. This nav bar, because it's an app-wide concept, the idea of course is consistency. It looks the same in all the screens we have in our app, so you'll find the settings here in app styles. There's a little graphic here that shows what these different colors mean in relation to the app's navigation. So we can see here that, okay, primary color, that's the one we want to change. Let's use the color picker. Let's pick that color from over here. That's it. Yep, and there we have it. Well, we do need to change the text color as well. So this one is navbar title color to white. And actually we want to also change this action color. If we look back to the sketch design, this button should be white, so let's also change its action color to white. Yep, and we can already do the same for this screen. So let's take out these imported pieces here, we don't need them, and enable the real nav bar, and that's it. So going back to this screen's layout problems, first we can see that all of these were actually placed in the foreground group. That's not going to be what we want, since we want this content to be scrollable. So this is actually something we can again specify on the sketch side. It's possible to use a prefix of FG to indicate that something goes in the foreground, or SF for scroll flow, and that was done in the other screen, but in this one it's not there, but that's no problem. Let's just grab these items and drop them into scroll flow. And actually let's take out this one altogether. We're going to turn this into a real list anyway. We don't need that piece there. And fixing some of this layout that came from Sketch, it overflows the screen. There's no point really in that. What we want is for this component to be attached on both left and right sides. And finally, inside the component, let's do the same thing there. This image should stretch to fill, and maybe this one should actually be aligned to the right edge with a little offset, so something like that. Let's go back to the previous one. Okay, this looks already a lot closer to what we might want here, so we can see that the background image stretches on each device, and the text is aligned at a specific offset. And again, we could use something like a keyline to make this position different, or it's even possible to do device-specific overrides. So if you want to make a layout change that only affects a specific size, we can also do that. We can always double-click on one of these screen sizes to enter editing for overrides in just that one screen. And the green background indicates that you're doing overrides for one device size, so be careful. But in general, what we want to do is to get the base format right so that the responsiveness is defined in a way that makes sense for all of the screen sizes. Same thing for this one. So I think what we just want to do is make the background color extend to fill the container. So again, we just enable the right. And actually, let's add a background color for this screen. Otherwise it has transparent background and that might cause some weird issues, for example, for transition animations. That's roughly it. Of course, we don't have a list here yet, so that's going to be the next thing we want to fix. So how do we actually turn this one element, this one component we have here, into something that has content that we can change and update and is reflecting data? That's the next thing we'll do. So now we get to use the Data tab. What we see here by default is pretty much empty. There are actually two kinds of data, sort of pieces of data that we can use in a React Studio project. Slots are for storing information. Let's add one just to see what happens. For example, we could have a slot named username, which would be a text slot. Maybe the default value would be something we want to use for previews, and we can even add a comment here that this value will be loaded from API after login, just so that whoever opens this project knows that, well, what happens to this, where is this value actually used for. But in this project we're not going to use any slots. We'll just use a sheet, a data sheet, which is sort of like a mini database that we can either build here in place, or we can load from an API or data source using a data plugin. So let's name this sheet, let's call it list data. And looking back at our design, the idea here is that we'll use this data to fill this list. So we need to kind of figure out what's the data going to be. We have a picture, we have a title, and then we have a description here. So let's create those columns. Call the first one picture. It's an image column, obviously. Then we'll have a title and description one. And let's add some rows of data. Now it's still empty, but I have some placeholder pictures I'm just going to load here. If we had a data source, for example, maybe we already have a blog or something we would like to source this from, we could use a data plugin to load this into React Studio. We certainly don't have to do this manually. We could also load it from a Google Sheet. We have a bunch of these plugins either available or coming very soon. So in that case, we would specify the data source here and then just click Reload Data from Service to fill it out automatically. But in this case, we're just mocking up stuff, so we can just type our content here for the preview. And let's copy some placeholder text for this last field. With a little bit of variation, just so we can see that it's different from one row to another. Okay, that's it. That's our basic mockup data. So now comes the part where we need to change this imported component into an actual list. We can simply delete this for now, and we're going to be using the list grid element for this purpose. So as you can see, this is under a header called containers. There's a couple of other useful container element types. Selector is one that can be used to make, for example, tab bars. So you can have a component that functions as the button, and then its content displays a highlight for just one of the selected item, and this component can then change the content of something else on the page. So that's a really useful piece for creating tabbed navigation. Columns is a layout piece. This lets you make responsive designs where on a narrow phone or narrow device you'll see the elements placed on top of each other, and then on a wider screen they'll be side by side, and it all happens automatically. You can just specify how many columns you want on each device size. But for now we'll be using list/grid. Let's drop one here. As it says here, content not set, so what we need to do is tell this list that what's the item we want to repeat and what's the data that will be used to fill it out. First, let's make this stretch across the screen. Then we'll choose the component over here in element. It was called list item, and now it tells us that we don't actually have a data source yet, so it's empty. Let's go to the data tab, and we'll bring this from a data sheet. Okay. Now we can see that, well, it defaults to a 2-column mode, which is not what we want here, although it looks fine on the wider. So what we can do is specify that, okay, let's have one column on the narrow, but let's have 2 columns on the tablet sizes. So now this is a list on the narrow devices, but becomes a grid in the wider ones, and that's great. But something's still missing. We got 5 items here, just like we have 5 items in our data, but the content is not coming through. And that's because we're missing the linkage between the data and these elements. So that's easily fixable. Let's double click to go in the component and look out here in the data tab. So what we want to specify is what's called in Reactor Property, and this is what we're doing here is really property linkage. We have some data that comes from outside this component, and we want to change the content of the elements here based on those properties. So selecting the image, we can here specify that, okay, the image content should come from a property named picture. And this list is actually automatically populated based on the columns and slots we have in the data tab. But if we know that, for example, if we're making a component that will be connected later in manually by developer to some data source, we can always make a new property by just clicking create new and typing in a property name. That's also completely possible. For now, let's add these linkage to these text elements as well. So for the title one, and finally for the description one. And what we see happen here is that actually there's a convenient preview of this linkage, so that we know that this component is going to be changed based on outside data. React Studio shows us the list of the properties being used, and gives a little line that points to the element where it's being connected. So let's go back to the previous screen, and ta-da! That's our data displayed here in the list. And what we can do is we can open this in the browser just to see that, well, the same thing should happen there. Yes, indeed. And as we can see, the list is responsive just as we specified on a narrow device. It stays stays in one column and then it stretches to two-column grid on a wider device. And that's already quite a nice achievement compared to the very static drawing we started from. We're now in a real live HTML with data that comes from mockup here, but which we could replace with a data plugin to actually load this from a service. So finally, we do need to fix the detail view for one of these. If I click on this one, it does take me to the detail screen, and we can see that this back button works as expected. That's all part of the standard navigation, but the content here doesn't change based on the item we clicked. To make that happen, we need to use something called carrying properties through navigation. Looking here back in React Studio, the connector actually says no properties carried, so that's a hint that we need to do something to make the data follow along. Let's choose this image element, which is the one where I had the interaction, and tell it to carry all properties from parent component. And looking back here, now it says carries all properties. Okay, that's great. Then let's go into the adventure screen. This one also needs a background. And now we can see here that we have a bunch of properties that have appeared here because they are carried by navigation. Super convenient, so we know that these are available. They're the same ones we had in the list item, and then there's one called datasheet row, which is a container for all of the data we would have here, which is it's pretty often the case that we're not showing all the data in the list item, but we would want to show more data out here, so we can use the datasheet row to access anything that's available in the data structure. Here we need to do a bit of maintenance just to make these put these elements in the right place. We do want this to be all in the scroll flow. Maybe we'll make this one stretch across the screen. That seems okay for now. And then we just specify the linkage. So over here in data with the image selected, we'll take its content from the picture property for this one, from the title property, and finally the description property. And that's it really. And let's click on one of these. This is swamp creatures. Yep, same picture, same title. So the data is being carried through thanks to the magic of React properties. Pretty nice. So there we have it. This is sort of like a real SPA single page app that we built from the static sketch design. What we can do next is see what happens with the mobile preview. So obviously, if you're developing a mobile-first app, it's just seeing it on a desktop browser is nothing like the real experience. So we have a convenient tool that lets you simply click on mobile preview, and what happens here is that it builds the whole project using a Webpack. That's a really powerful build tool for web projects, and what we're using is actually something called a Create React App, which is a sort of boilerplate created by Facebook for making React apps that conform to their best practices. So actually what you get from React Studio when you click export here, or even open in web browser, what it does, it gives you a complete Create React App based project with all the components in code and all the assets in place and everything. And if you do export, you can just take that code and do whatever you like with it. But in this case with mobile preview, what it actually does is it packages up this React app and uploads it to our Neon cloud server for preview. and we can take this URL. We could copy it through the clipboard even to an iPhone, but in this case let's just open it in the same browser here. And yep, looks exactly the same. Loads a bit slower because obviously this is not a local server anymore, but otherwise everything is just the same. And here we can see that one of the very nice things about a single page app is the non-existent load times. Everything is instant and snappy. When we navigate to a page, one of these details views, there's no loading pauses. It's especially on mobile, it will make a big difference. And for now, we don't, as you can see, it's we don't have a transition animation here moving between the screens, but that's definitely something we're going to add in React Studio pretty soon. We want to make the navigation feel like what happens on native mobile apps usually is a sliding effect going from one screen to another. So we'll be supporting those nice touches that you can add to make your app feel more like more fluid and more like what users expect on mobile. And also there's something called code glance, which I'll show you quickly. So this is just where we can take a look at the generated code for one of these screens or part individual components. And that's all there is to that. Let's look at my schedule. I think I've pretty much covered everything I was meaning to here. And I don't think we have any questions at this point, but of course you can always contact us. There's a chat window inside React Studio. You can access it from here. You can send us feedback using a form. We have a Slack channel. If you want to join that, we can just contact us and we'll send you an invite to the Slack channel. And we'd be really happy to hear about what you're planning to do, what you would like to see happen in React Studio next. We're still, having just launched, we're definitely looking for opportunities where the product can go next, and that probably covers everything from me. So we're going to have another webinar pretty soon, maybe within 2 weeks. And if there's any topic you would like to see covered then, please do get in touch. You can sign up for the webinar on our site. You'll find it on the React Studio webpage as well. And of course, if you signed up for this webinar already, we'll just send you in advance information about the next one, so you'll know if it's something you want to join or not. Thanks for tuning in. That's all from me, and hope to see you soon with more React Studio demos and tips and tricks. Thank you.